This is an event that we are doing in cooperation of IWM, the Institute for Human Sciences, with the Center for Transcultural Studies, CTS. Dilip, I was working for many years at a place in Prague called CTS. It was the Center for Theoretical Studies. Your place is the Center for Transcultural Studies. We are very happy for this institutional cooperation, and institutional cooperation is great, but those who make the cooperation run in the end, it's not institutions, it's people behind. And it's very much you, Dilip, who made not only this evening happen, but who also made happen what we are doing tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. We will have a 2-day conference following this opening evening. The title of the conference will be Towards Democratic Renewal, Theory and Practice. And Dilip, both of it, this evening and the conference that we will have the next 2 days, it would not have been possible without you. So much of time, energy, and good spirit you invested in the planning of this evening, and I think this deserves to be especially remarked tonight. And I would ask you, please stand up for 1 second and let us give you an applause for this great preparation. Thanks, Dilip. It's really, I mean it. This is your thing that is going to happen. Let me also add that after this, a bit longer evening, as I said, a bit longer evening, but it's, as my colleague Harold just reminded me, it's the summer solstice, so it's the longest day. So we have a bit more time. So we have a bit more time also for the talk of tonight. It will be a bit longer evening, but it will also be a highly inspiring evening, I'm sure. And let me already announce that after that, we will have some wine and cheese for you downstairs. Please feel invited to join us for that. With that, I'm handing over to Shalini Randeria, President and Rector of CEU, and as I might also add, for some years also Rector of this institution, important to note. So, Shalini, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be in charge of just timekeeping. I'm going to do nothing else, but I would be remiss in my duties if I didn't introduce Charles Taylor and Craig Calhoun, who actually need no introduction at the IWM. Definitely not. But I think since we are recording, and I don't know who the worldwide audience is going to be, I think I'm going to say a few words. Charles has several lines of connection to the IWM, one of them being that he's still our non-resident permanent fellow, and it's a great pleasure, Charles, to have you back. For those of you who know him and his work, he's among the world's most preeminent philosophers, and he was my teacher at the University of Oxford, where he was a Fellow of All Souls and held the chair of social and political philosophy, so it's a double pleasure for me to be here with Charles. Craig is currently professor of sociology at the Arizona State University. He used to be the president of SSRC, Social Science Research Council in New York, and was then director of the London School of Economics. So Craig is someone who knows European crises of democracy as well as the one transatlantic. And therefore, I'm not going to say anything more by way of introduction. We have a very strict time limit. I'm just going to hand over the word to both of you. It's been a great pleasure to read the book. And I've had the pleasure of having interviewed both of you on my podcast, and I'm looking forward to interview Dilip, who is running away from this interview since 6 months. So I'll catch up with you, don't you worry. Therefore, let me just hand over to you, Charles, and then to Craig. Then you may want to be in conversation with one another briefly, and then we can open out for questions.
We thought you had been storing up a difficult question for us
I
ever
have.
since the podcast.
So shall I start with my questions?
Okay, yes.
All right. Okay. So I have questions for both of you together and one each for you. My first question is, why do you use the term degeneration? It's an organic metaphor, and from a non-Hindu, I would say this is about like a Hindu theory of recycling of life, of degeneration, regeneration, and ultimately, if it's not a reincarnation, it'll be our luck. So I'm worried about the term because I think, in a way, what it doesn't focus on, so I understand why you want to regenerate, but the degeneration has a feeling as if it's an organic process of its own. Whereas my feeling is we are in a world in which we have what I call soft authoritarian leaders, but we can call them something else, who are actively dismantling democracy. So this is not an organic process. This is a politically willed process of, on the one hand, hollowing out liberal democratic institutions from the inside, and on the other hand, of actually, and this takes something into account something which Craig has been writing about, it's about austerity politics. And austerity politics and its relationship to authoritarianism or the dismantling of democracy in a way that it's not somehow an unintended consequence of austerity politics. These are governments which are impoverishing people by design. So that's why I was puzzled by this metaphor of degeneration and regeneration, because, Charles, one of your major concepts in the book is citizen efficacy. So what you're arguing for is very much about the practice of democracy, the spaces in which we can practice it. And in fact, as one of your countrymen, Til van Raden, who was also our fellow here at IWM, he has a book on democracy as a way of life. So the question would be, is it really about degeneration of institutions, or is it about dismantling on the one hand? And if we want to regenerate it, are we not looking for not just institutions which need to be protected, but also practices by citizens?
Yeah, I think can answer that. The historic view behind all this, and maybe degeneration is the wrong word because it has a smell of decay or something like that. But it's this, that you never get, the idea of getting a democracy working once and for all is an illusion for two reasons. Democracy is a system in which the demos, the common people, the plebs, have a very important share and are not shunted out by the oligarchs, right? But it's much, much easier for oligarchs to take over than for the people to have their share, because that requires a great, vast organization is coming together in various forms of organization, and these can easily lose, their breath a little bit, and then society slides back into control by the, if you like, the oligarchs, the few. This is made even more the case because the bases of power of the few keep changing. So in the 18th century, it was what? Large landed property. Then you get the era of the robber barons and its ownership of large industry. Now it's been transferred in some degree to financial power. So not only is there an inherent tendency, if one doesn't keep one's guard up, of losing the, if it were, demographic influence and control, but also you need to reconstruct the whole thing, because what you're fighting against, what you're working against, is going to change. So the message is, you never get democracy once and for all. It's a goal. We use the word Tita concept, but it's the kind of ideal goal. And if you look at history, what you see is periods when you're moving away and periods when you're moving back. And we've had a period of moving away. So the book is partly a diagnosis of that, and then an attempt to describe how we could climb back. But that notion of degeneration is, maybe we shouldn't have used the image of rotting flesh that may come to people's minds. But it's the thing is always sliding away from your hands, right? Democracy. Always threatens to slide away.
So I thought it was an image of sexual perversion that degeneracy brought up. And so I signed on to something not fully understanding this. Let me... I think Chuck put his finger on the core idea, which is that there is no point at which you've got perfect democracy, and you can just hold on to it. That's partly because of the nature of democracy being as Chuck said, constituted by the effort to keep pursuing goals that keep being beyond your reach.
Yeah.
And they keep being beyond your reach partly because the world changes and you change the goals as it goes. It's not that somebody sets the goals in the middle of the French Revolution and then they are always the goals. It is that the meaning of the notion of democracy, the meaning of the ideal that we're chasing, gets redefined. And it gets redefined by greater inclusion, for example, so that it's not very controversial to leave women out of the demos in the late 18th century, and it becomes increasingly controversial, partly because of actual social movements and campaigns to change that. So part of our idea is that democracy lives and has its vitality in its relationship to movements and projects to keep redefining it, in a sense. But secondly, the existence of democracy is never the whole story. Democracy is either thriving or decaying or degenerating, whatever term we want to use, in relation to social conditions. Democracy presumes social conditions that support it. So very much the issue of democracy as a way of life is crucial, and this is a Tocquevillian theme as well, that democracy is a way of life, that it extends to the ways citizens relate to each other in other aspects of their lives besides just the ballot box or formal political procedures. And that way of life itself is subject to change. And so one reason to use the term degenerate, or to at least think in terms of something like a degeneration, is to recognize that there's something else going on in the decay or troubles or difficulties of democracy besides a purely political moment. That the troubles of democracy have to do with the relationship of democracy to other social conditions. So in perhaps a paramount way, to capitalism and the changing character of capitalism throughout the modern era. All modern democracies throughout the whole of modernity, the large-scale representative democracies, have been married, to continue the sexual perversion theme, have been married to capitalism. Right? There aren't any examples where you get these large-scale democracies and you don't have capitalism, and capitalism has a shaping influence. And people will debate, is that distorting or is it helping? But it's a shaping influence in any case. And so you get continued innovation. As Chuck says, you move from landed property to industrial and other big fortunes, to high tech, to this and that. But not only that, you get things like the neoliberal era, with its dismantling of institutions, with its undermining of local communities, with its dispossession. Now, I would say that this is like the enclosure movements of an earlier era. Something that people held in common in their lives is being taken from them, and they're left then with reduced shared resources, including for democracy, including for running their lives collectively in this.
You said something absolutely catastrophic.
So I think it's probably that this microphone is touching my beard or something like that. Some very mundane explanation. And I'll tie that into my closing remark, which is that Shalini's absolutely right. I think all three of us agree that she's absolutely right that democracy is being attacked. If I'm using this, are you able to stop that crackling? The democracy is being attacked. There are people who are intentionally, willfully trying to reduce the influence citizens have over their lives and over the countries they live in. There are people for whom that's not the goal, but it's a conscious byproduct. They don't mind if that happens, so long as they're able to ensure some other goals, like the continued growth of their large corporations or whatever it might be, right? But I think what we want to say is you would be misunderstanding the depth of our troubles and the nature of our troubles if you thought that was the whole story. If you thought the only problems democracy faced were the attacks by the anti-democrats or the plutocrats, and you miss the extent to which there was an undermining and an internal problem within our societies that made democracy harder. And we spend a fair amount of time trying to analyze what that might be, and well, we either do or we don't. You'll have to read the book and judge.
Okay, let me pick up on two things which both of you said. One, let me go immediately back to what you said, Craig, about the relationship between capitalism and democracy, because I think this will bring us to something about what the varieties of capitalism as they are married to varieties of democracy. And is it really about a marriage between capitalism and democracy, which is a propitious one, or was the successful marriage really between democracy and the welfare state in Western Europe? And it's the dismantling of the welfare state which is creating a lot of the problems, because what you're getting is an unbundling of citizenship rights where political rights don't necessarily go together with economic rights. And the demos in this city is a very good example. In many districts in Vienna, the Socialist Party has lost its voters because most of them do not have the vote anymore. They are immigrants who are disenfranchised. So that what you are getting is the fact that the nation state is territorially bounded, but your demos doesn't include residents. It includes only those whom you confer political rights on, and those are conferred by and large in Western Europe through ethnic considerations rather than considerations of residence. So there's a mismatch, if you like, between the demos. One, because you can, like in the Hungarian case, you can go across the border and include your diaspora when you like, or parts of your diaspora in Transylvania and Romania. You exclude other parts of your diaspora in Britain by making sure the younger people all have to go to London to vote, but the diaspora in neighboring countries can vote through postal ballot. So you include some parts of your diaspora, you exclude some parts, and then, of course, all the migrants, the asylum seekers, all of those who are even third-generation residents who don't fulfill the ethnic criteria will not be given citizenship. So I think it's really on the one hand, the unbundling of a lot of the rights which were together in the welfare state, which is on the one hand a major problem for democracy because of the disenfranchisement of people who are living there but don't have voting rights. And secondly, capitalism poses a completely different order of magnitude of a problem, because I think it'll bring in one of the questions, Craig, which you address in the book, which is a question of scale. Because there is something abstract and quite opaque about the way the capitalist system operates, but the scale on which most people are able to mobilize and act politically is at the most the nation state, but also actually quite effectively sometimes at a much smaller local community scale. And then you have cunning states, as I call them, who basically are saying, we are unable to protect our citizens against the power of corporations. So basically, the scale at which most citizens can vote is a scale of institutions where the state is it's basically pretending that it's unable to do something for which it really doesn't have the political will, which is to check the power of corporations, to affect negatively the daily lives of citizens. So I think it might be good to unpack the relationship between democracy, welfare state, successful ones. And since Yogen is looking at me, I'm thinking India is a very good example of a very different kind of marriage between a non-welfare state in some ways when democracy was established. And so, I mean, with Bourdieu, one can talk of the right and the left hand of the state and say, you have on the one hand a strengthening of both the right hand of the state with a lot more control and surveillance mechanisms being put into place in democracies, in liberal democracies, so countering liberal principles, if you like. And on the other hand, you have in the many Western democracies, a dismantling of the left hand of the state. But this is something which you cannot say in a country like India. You have, for many years, a lot of state spending at the same time that you are putting a lot of control and surveillance mechanisms, that they go together in the Indian case. So I think we really need to look at varieties of capitalism and of democracy.
Well, yes, there are two things here that you raise, very, very important. One is the relation to capitalism. And, but I'd like to talk about another one. But before I move on to the other one, that's been key that the mindset, if you like, of societies as they've been run in the West in the last 50 years has been dominated by neoliberalism, the idea that the market sorts everything out and it all works out. And this never was a good idea and revealed more and more why it was such a bad idea. But it's very unfortunate that the left parties have been co-opted into this outlook. The Social Democrats in Germany and the Labour in England and so on. And that's one big problem. But I want to raise another one, and these two are, which is the problem of, if you like, foreigners, exclusion, xenophobia, right? Mm-hmm. And we're in a situation where there are two kinds of people that are being targeted as as outsiders. First, because of the tremendous increase in international migration, a lot of people coming as refugees are understood by the people in this receiving society as outsiders. And the problem is that, I think you can say, it's a sort of general rule, that if people that have been living among themselves who are ethnically identified in a certain way for a long time, and then a lot of people come from outside, it takes a while for them to adjust to this, and there are xenophobic reactions. I mean, the surprising thing for me has been that even a country like Sweden, I think there are few populations that have a higher ethical notion of their world responsibility than the Swedes, but the presence of a lot of people from non-Scandinavian has produced this reaction of the new party, which is really upset very much the Swedish situation. The second very important kind of xenophobia is a kind which targets people inside who are considered not real members and not 100% members. And there, I think, and here we're talking about the American case. This is a classic case, but the French case is also very important, because there's been an attempt in Western society, very powerfully pushed by very strong movements of people demanding equality, but on the part of women who had not equality to go out and find jobs, on the part of blacks in the United States, on the part of indigenous people in various parts of the Western world and so on. And that has produced a kind of backlash. And the backlash has been what major figures have surfed on. So the presidency of Trump is really entirely based on this backlash. And the Republicans, various Republican rivals, are simply imitating him, and people like DeSantis and so on. So the task before us is really tremendously complex, because it involves the very important part that you mentioned, a certain degree of control, not accepting over capitalism, not accepting the idea that that neoliberalism is the best way to go, not accepting because neoliberalism and globalization left to itself will produce products of individual consumption at the cheapest rate and the largest amount, because they'll find the various countries to manufacture. But what they also do is they totally starve the public sector. So when something like the pandemic arrives, we all find ourselves without an adequate health system, without an adequate transport system, and so on and so on. And so this has to be changed. And this has to be changed in a context in which the people were very often the parties were fighting against in order to get the power to do this. Let's look at the United States, right? Is winning or having great capacity to advance because it is beating the xenophobic drum against, appealing to all the anxieties of those men who feel anxious because women are equal, those whites who always really felt, well, we're superior to the blacks, but now they're rising and so on. And we have to fight these two battles at the same time and mobilize the political power to do that. I stop here for a minute because
Okay, so I mostly, but not entirely agree, and maybe discussion's better if there's some disagreement. Partly about how to put the same facts into a story, but a little bit about the facts. So first, I don't think what you talk about as backlash pushing Donald Trump is the whole story. This is a manipulated backlash with wealthy figures behind media and other efforts to make it go forward and to create cases. So it's not just that spontaneously people who have felt they were in an ethnic solidarity then say, oh, but those people are bad. That's more organized. There's more money and media and activity. A little bit what Shalini was talking about in her first comment about it, whether it's the Koch brothers or whoever it is in these cases. And the second thing I want to sort of quibble with, and then I'll make my major re-narrativization, is when I say a marriage between democracy and capitalism, I do sort of mean it. And I think the welfare state is an interesting phase in that, in which you get organized capitalism, as it was called. So the era of organized capitalism in the middle of the 20th century included building welfare state institutions, which had some older roots in different contexts in European societies and so forth, but included building the welfare state in response to labor movements and so forth. But it also included coming up with a domestication of the class struggle. I think that's actually your phrase, Charles, but a domestication of the class struggle with unions being recognized but limited. Right, with social democratic parties working, if you will, within the system and in a nod back to Bernstein, evolutionary socialist goals, not revolutionary. And so the mid-20th century stabilization isn't just the welfare state, right? It is a set of institutional arrangements in which there are limits imposed on capital monitored by governments. There's an empowerment of labor, but a limit to that empowerment. There are the provisions that get grouped together as the welfare state. And this all begins to come apart, particularly between about 1968 and 75. Two things on it. One is that not everybody loved it when it was in power. So we may look back and say, well, that stabilized, and that was better than what came after in some ways, but it was far from perfect because it also put in place a lot of limits on social movements, limits on progress in various arenas in society, and covered up sort of inequities, right? So it's not just an era in which everybody's getting along with each other famously. It's an era when the struggles are sort of muted and managed. And it turns out, compared to the rapacious era that comes afterwards, that muted and managed isn't all bad. That stability is sort of good, something that was argued. Now I transition to my other part, by, not by George Soros, but by another famous Hungarian, Karl Polanyi, right? That the actual devastating character of upheaval is itself a social problem. And that answers that say something like, well, you have an industrial revolution, a lot of people's lives get ruined, but eventually wages are higher, right? Well, the eventually is too late. It invites the famous Keynesian rejoinder, right? In the long run, we'll all be dead. So in the long run, wages going up isn't quite a solution to immediate suffering, right? Now, I think that what we're looking at should be narrated differently in this sense. And I think it is capitalism throughout the absolutely different varieties of capitalism, different phases, different national configurations, and so forth. First, we should look at a modern era that starts always already racialized and structured by capital as well as politics, right? So we start with the era of the slave trade and plantations and early colonization of non-Western parts of the world by Western Europe, right? And this is simultaneously capitalism and the state. And the capitalism and the state are building a world. Now, what is that building process doing? It's building what will eventually be the capacity to have welfare states in Europe, but it is unbuilding and destabilizing society in a variety of other settings, and for many people in European countries, for whom this is not a benign transition entirely either. So that you have if you insist, as I want to, that the social really matters in addition to the economic and the political, what you have is a state-building project and a capitalist project, both of which are conspiring in many ways to destabilize social solidarity throughout much of the modern era, and sort of recurrently. And there are recurrently efforts to come back. So the welfare state is an effort to defend society, right? In one of his late series of lectures at the College of France, Foucault's Society Must Be Defended, right, talks about another set of contexts for this. But earlier, social democracy is a project not just of trade unionism and getting better wage deals. It is a project of trying to defend and rebuild society in the face of the upheavals caused by industrialization and capitalism, right? So the social democratic project, which will eventually inform the welfare state, but is itself a project. And socialists here, for example, in Vienna, right, have a project of building a way of life that will be sustainable. So housing and childcare and you know, all kinds of support systems for the social that are not merely adjustments of inequality, if you will. They are also, you know, restoration or maintenance of social solidarity. So I think we go through this throughout. Now, to get to the present then, I think what you rightly narrate about the issues of immigrants in the disabled have to do with the mismatch of states and capitalism to a very large extent. Right? So you have a capitalism not being the whole story, but a variety of things going on in the world that issue out of this path of social change that I've given a sort of 60-second version of, but a path of social change that results in a hierarchical world system in which there are countries that have difficulty maintaining order and development in their societies. You have countries that are aspiring to get richer and imposing various kinds of internal inequities in order to try to become richer. I mean, I'm going to anticipate the Indian session and maybe correct entirely by Yogendra and Mukulika, but I'd say, you know, part of the story is an aspiring middle class and an aspiring government that intends to move up the hierarchy of nation states and be richer and is willing to impose certain kinds of injustices domestically, partly in order to meet that goal, as well as because of religious or other biases. And there are versions of this around. So the situation of Black Americans is structured back to that early origin with the slave trade all the way through in recurrent phases and moves back and forth. You have Reconstruction and you have the reaction against Reconstruction that Du Bois so famously analyzed, right? And so we see in this a constant pattern that is not quite 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. First, you're never sure it's not going to be 3 steps backward, right? And second, there are sideways steps. There are things that change that are not just on a path of progress. But you have this sort of movement through the history of these societies. And the issue of trying to achieve social solidarity of some kind just remains an issue in the face of these large systems that are at odds with it. And I'll close by saying, and part of what happens with the welfare state is that a lot of people come to experience it as a large-scale systemic apparatus that is sort of alien to their everyday lives. You have to deal with the bureaucrats all the time. And so it loses some of its popular support in complaints about having become a sort of impersonal system, too distant, not caring enough in all of this. So that the I still like that Foucauldian phase, that attempt to protect and save society is an important theme that takes different configurations in all of this and doesn't reduce to either just build a good welfare state or just have smooth and efficient capitalism, that some form of rebuilding, renewing, maintaining the social is crucial.
So just one quick comment on that and last question, then we turn to the audience. So Craig, I think I don't quite agree on that one point, that the problem of the welfare state and its dismantling is not a question of people saying, oh, this is too much paperwork for me. It's the rich who have walked out of the social contract.
It's not an either-or choice.
Yeah. So I think the disillusionment really was not something which galvanized into a movement.
Oh, I don't know. 1968, 1975, the amount of protests, the long march through the institutions, the extent to which you had in the 68 to 75 protests, possibly misguided, but you had a movement complaining about the state, and you had what Habermas called a legitimacy crisis of the Western welfare state that had been built to achieve legitimacy and paper over the problems of capitalism, but that entered a legitimacy crisis.
Yes, I mean, okay. So, I mean, it's a separate argument on whether it really, the colonization of everyday life, as Habermas calls it, was the real problem. I think one major problem was this social contract worked as long as the rich were willing to pay into the system. What you are now seeing in Scandinavia, for example, is even in Scandinavia, to take Charles's example, a lot of the rich are just leaving the country with their money and are choosing to, not only just move to tax havens, but even to move within Europe to other countries. So it's very much a question of what. So there's a demographic crunch on the system. There is a social contract, which is breaking up. But the question I wanted to ask both of you, because I think we need to go over to the next panel's idea of regeneration of democracy, and since Craig has also written so much on social movements, so my question to you would be my puzzle that two movements which I would have predicted would happen, transnational movements, strong transnational movements, which should have happened in the last 2 years, did not happen. One, I thought 3 years ago actually almost, that there will be a very strong movement against the patenting of COVID vaccines. We have seen that movement in the Transnational Action Campaign against HIV/AIDS patents, beginning in South Africa and then going global, and that did not happen, although AIDS affected a much smaller proportion of the population than did COVID globally, and we saw no movement. The other thing on which I thought there would be a social movement and a strong social movement is women's rights, especially women's reproductive rights, because we had that movement around the Cairo UN conference, 1992-93, very, very large transnational global women's health coalition and social movements nationally, internationally, which led to the Cairo Declaration on reproductive rights and reproductive freedom. They're being dismantled in country after country, and there is no reaction on a scale at which you would expect, except you see sometimes in Poland, of course, we had a very strong social mobilization around the question of abortion and contraception, but that was one. But there is the absence of the social movements on a transnational scale, which I think are the sociological puzzle, where we had them 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to go ahead?
Yes, you go ahead, because
on the movements, I more or less agree. I mean, I think that is a puzzle. Why is this dog not barking? That doesn't mean there aren't explanations. And there are sort of two different sides. So I'm not very surprised by the minimal mobilization over the patency of COVID vaccines. I'm scandalized by the way in which government-subsidized research was privatized through the patenting process. I'm totally scandalized by it. I'm not so shocked because I don't think there was a strong beginning point for that mobilization. I'm a little more surprised in the case of women because I think there were stronger beginning points for the mobilization. And you get some of it. So, in the U.S., you do get a significant turnout in a midterm election after the Supreme Court abolishes the right to abortion and women are mobilized. Not as much as they might be. I completely agree with you.
And national, Craig, and not transnational. So
Absolutely,
we're going
and
to
not
listen to
transnational.
the Indian ones, which are also national. And that's what the interesting thing for me is.
But here, I think the extent, I think many things have gone on, but let me just simplify to two that I think are help to explain this and are more significant in general. One of them is we should be asking, why are we living in this era of nationalism? And why did we not see it coming? And I think the answer is that it is, in part, a response to the depredations of transnational capitalism, and in part, manipulated from above for various purposes by elites and all of this. So I think there are people who really have been on the losing end of globalization and changes. They may be misidentifying who they should be angry at, but they're not wrong about having been on the losing end of some social changes, seeing property values, right? What's the transformation of property values and housing costs in every major European capital, practically, and major cities in the U.S. and elsewhere around the world. So there's that. Now, and then there's the shock and upset of people at discovering that they are being seen as, perhaps correctly, those Swedes that we were talking about, are rich. There are richer Swedes who are engaged in tax evasion and leaving the country, but Swedes as a group are rich compared to a lot of people in the world. And so a byproduct of the globalization of the era is exposing some of this contradiction that was previously managed and all of that. But so I think, first question, why the nationalism in that? And then within nations and on a larger scale, you get what happened to social democracy, as I forget, what happened to the trade union movements, to social democracy, to serious labor parties, to socialist parties that thrived in Europe? Well, various things happened. One is that almost all the European socialist parties bought into a more or less neoliberal ideological view of social change, and they practically echoed Margaret Thatcher in saying there is no alternative. And so New Labour in Britain continued the policies, basically, of the Thatcherite revolution and neoliberalism, together with some efforts to be more benign. But let's have more care for the aged. Well, but let's do a little bit more of something. But basically, right, there's that, right? Now we can then have, why does neoliberalism win the day so completely ideologically? Why do they capitulate? Well, part of the answer, and I know the British case much better than I know some others in Europe, though I actually think it's a wider answer. It's less evident everywhere. It's more extreme there and in the US, is that the Social Democrats become the party of the educated professionals rather than the party of labor. Labor in Britain, despite its name, becomes the party of the graduates of elite universities working as professionals in London and Manchester. And something similar happens to the US. We don't have time to go through the story of what is being stigmatized as woke campaigns and multiculturalism and all the politics of identity, but part of that story is the split between the kind of politics that is being produced among university students and graduates and professionals in certain settings, and the working class, and the extent to which the working class has been alienated from a left which has gone over to the side of a rising professional middle class, leaving the working class frustrated. And many in the working class have turned to what gets called right-wing populism or something, but have turned to various kinds of other positions, Brexit, et cetera, partly because they got abandoned by the left. Now, the left was correct in the extent to which it diagnosed the rise of this new professional elite middle class bolstered by globalization, right? Yet it was also, right, giving up its traditional mission of social solidarity in this. And I think that means that there's not the starting point for taking to really large scale economically grounded campaigns that there should be. So on the issue of COVID vaccines, that should be a standard bearer for a campaign about the way in which property rights are organized. There should be a campaign about tax havens, right? About the whole tax avoidance issue. One of the things that happens to the welfare state, I will defend my notion that the populace is not mobilized to defend the welfare state, but part of what happens to it is tax avoidance, right? If, in fact, the richest people can avoid paying taxes, that's money the government doesn't have to fund the welfare state. Then another thing that happens is the rise of a new structure of corporate capitalism, a new structure of property rights based on intellectual property and non-intangible property that creates another body of wealth that the governments never catch up to in taxing. Now, the EU is trying to do more than the US, but it is barely getting going on trying to have a serious response to shopping for different tax venues, to offshore havens, to use of corporate organization to shield income, partly because of a technological and economic transformation in the nature of the income. It's not that they can't find cars, it's that cars are no longer the cutting edge of capital accumulation. That there's been all this change. But the bottom line of it then, if you want to ask the movements question, and we're going to ask it again in a week in a longer discussion, the bottom line is partly that the continuity with older movement starting points, and I think I can make some of the same case for the women's movement, though I don't think it's as clear and as extreme, gets broken.
Shall we open out for the next 10 minutes and then we hand over Jan? We need to give him a mic.
I was willing to show my commitment to social solidarity by offering my microphone.
No, but then you won't be heard.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to actually go back to Shalini's initial question about degeneration and regeneration, because in response, both of you have emphasized process, history, and that democracy is part of a larger landscape, which includes society, includes economy, capitalism, and so on. So I was thinking along those lines, Tim Mitchell's work on carbon democracy. So how coal is connected to unions and leads to a certain kind of welfare state. And then oil leads to a certain kind of transformation. And then you come to, for example, the discussion of neoliberalism in Wendy Brown's work, Undoing the Demos, where she says the economizing of everything, turning everything into winners and losers, also transforms politics into a question of winners and losers. Okay? Which then leads me to think that the question of sort of understanding democracy would be in terms of what Foucault would have called positivity, rather than degeneration and regeneration, because that leads to a kind of a narrative of, democratic backsliding and a question of, kind of fire brigade operation. How do we save democracy? Like the Lincoln Project, in the United States. This is how we save democracy. It leads to, rather than, a kind of emancipatory projects on democracy, it leads to this kind of a rearguard, again, neoliberal language. So I would say that I really think that degeneration and regeneration is not just, I think, a wrong metaphor, but I think it leads to a different kind of political solution.
Can I take Lenny together with that, and then I give you both the word? Will you pass it back to just the row behind you, to Lenny?
Thank you, Shalini. First, just on that point, I worry very much the way in which we talk about democracy and autocracy as a kind of gladiatorial fight to the death, in which one will vanquish the other. And I think that when we use terms like degeneration, which I don't find as inapposite perhaps than you do, but what does worry me is that there is no sense of how can democracies live with autocracy. How do democracies live with disinformation, because that's the reality at hand. Autocracies are not going to be vanquished. Disinformation is here with us forever, obviously in a much more metastasized form than it had been previously. But the point that I wanted to make, Craig, in terms of what you were decrying on the left, I heard some of your comments in blaming the left for the state of play. But if you think about Tony Judd's argument in Ill Fares the Land, Tony Judd was arguing that indeed people on the right have been effective and successful in appropriating and co-opting basic social democratic notions. And in many ways, when we think about Kaczynski or Putin or Marine Le Pen, it's quite evident that they have very much, they're speaking in the same language on the economic front. At the same time, when we think of someone like Giorgia Meloni, or even her teacher Berlusconi, they've made the EU safe for reactionary politics. The EU is now safe. So in many ways, I think it's been more a gambit on the side of the right in co-opting these ideas than the failures of the left.
So I find that a hard either or to adjudicate, but I agree with what you're saying. And let me repeat my usual historicist line, and this has been the story since the middle of the 19th century too. The whole idea of enlightened autocracy, Bismarck, etc., creating there is a recurrent pattern of successful right-wing co-optation. But I go further. I would say, were it not for the extent to which conservatives in Europe decided to embrace aspects of what had been social democratic causes and campaigns, there wouldn't be welfare states, there wouldn't be democracy in Europe in a variety of ways. And the conservatives do this, some of them, because there had always been a kind of Tory radical, my first book was partly about Tory radicals, that is, there had always been kind of people who were not so easy to categorize right and left, who had identified with conservatives against capitalist depredations rather than in favor of liberalism. The conservatives are partly getting a chance to secure the center of European politics against ultra-liberals. And so the radical parties that are mostly liberal capitalist parties in Europe, right, are being partly marginalized by this successful move of conservatives in various cases. The conservatives in Britain get Labour support in most of the early elections after the Reform Acts and all of this. So anyway, I agree with you. I just want to say it's a longer pattern. It's not just a one-time deal in which conservatives recently did. And my point about Labour is not to blame them for all the crisis, which, as I say, has these other characters, is to make that part of the explanation of why there's not as strong a left movement against this as there might be. I'm sympathetic to the idea, and I'm shifting to Jan's comment, that the term degeneration can be a problematic label for this. I still want to defend it. I don't think that just singling out the conscious attacks versus the social change would get it right. And while I am very sympathetic to the idea of moving to a rhetoric of liberation, I also think there were real problems with casting everything in that term, in that vein for a long time. It did not always serve the left, the wider people well. And I'm committed to a notion that there are democratic paths forward that are not neoliberal. So I don't think that this locks us in, but I agree with the basic points about Tim Mitchell's arguments. I think the nature of both national and transnational economic underpinnings shapes the nature of the political possibilities. And then you've got various parties that make their choices about where they're going to go in this, and politicians can choose wisely or poorly or perniciously in all of that. In the field of possibilities that are opened up to them. And part of what we see, is, as Lenny brings out, is a variety of different choices that are very hard to grasp simply in left and right terms, and combinations of positions in which the particular politicians seem to be on the quote left on this and the quote right on that issue. And it's, because the alignments are broken up, the parties are still dead men walking, right, who are stuck to certain kinds of ideas, but the actual alignments are shifting underneath them in many cases. And so we intellectuals trying to figure this out, and I'm not saying that we got this all right in the book or something, but something still worries me, is we need to figure out a way to describe and analyze this situation that doesn't fall back into versions of the left and right which were forged in and more apt to another era.
Charles, would you like to have a word, and then we hand over?
Yeah,
I think you're connected.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so, very briefly, I think that when we look at it in terms of struggle against, that we need to recreate solidarities that have been lost. That means both recreating the value of solidarity against various kinds of, neoliberalism, meritocracy, and all that kind of stuff. But it also means bridging very important populations. Now, take two cases. One, I think, is salvageable. The other, I think, is unsalvageable. U.S. and France. I think the U.S. is salvageable because it's possible in the people in the Rust Belt there. Biden managed to appeal to a lot of those workers, workers, with a program that was important for them as workers, and weaned them away from the other program, which I really agree with Craig, that this xenophobia is not spontaneous. It's generated by and invested in very heavily by all big money in the States. But he managed to win them away, and that is the path to success. Path to success with a program, like the Green New Deal, which will both deal with our real economic problems and will also put the planet on the right. Now, in the case of France, I think it really is close to hopeless because they have developed such a negative relationship to their Muslim minority, which is partly to do with their history. This is their colonized, that they've been fighting for 100 years, and so it's been very, very hard to create that kind of solidarity. And the power of people surfing on division, from Le Pen to Zemmour and so on, is so great and so powerful in French. And it's got hysterical. There are French intellectuals that I used to be able to talk to, and we can't talk anymore. It's just got to be that bad. So there's no way of putting together Les Insoumis of Mélenchon with other elements to create a real social democratic, if you like, alternative to that. You just have to hope that Macron, or whoever succeeds him, beats out Le Pen. So here you get, is there a possibility for creating this solidarity? In certain societies, yes, and that's the most important political goal, in my view.
So can I just take on one more comment, which I agree with Chuck about that, and we sort of end the book on a note of hope, but not confidence. But back to Lenny's comments about Meloni or Le Pen and all this, an interesting thing is that the U.S. has very few figures like this. That the nature of the polarization in the U.S. has a so-called right wing that is still committed to something like a libertarian / neoliberal capitalist rhetoric, and hostile to all versions of the welfare state, I think mainly because of racism, frankly. I think the single biggest driver of that is the wrong people benefit from the welfare state. But it's expressed as though it's a principled objection to government spending money and all of this. And the result is a kind of polarization that is different. In lots of ways, the US and European countries look similar on these issues, but in this regard, the production of a sort of right wing that is co-opting social democratic positions in order to appeal to a disaffected working class, right? That's a pretty distinctive European thing. The Americans are appealing, Trump or somebody is appealing to a disaffected white working class, but with a different, not social democratically inspired set of arguments, and much more directly racist.
So I think in the interest of fairness and that everybody gets a drink later, I think we're going to close this discussion for now. And I think we're going to continue it tomorrow in any case at the conference. And I'll hand over to Dilip to conduct the second panel. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Downstairs is the kitchen. Damit so gern was du denn unten, gell? Yes. Ja. Thank you so much. I think there was like a wire. Wire was loose or something. Yeah, I think there is a thing. It was not your PU. Yeah? It was not. For sure not.
Okay. We're going to start now. As in the concluding remark, you'll notice Professor Charles Taylor said he can no longer speak to his French intellectual colleagues, but he somehow is able to manage to continue to talk to Indian intellectual colleagues. And that's why we have lots of Indian intellectuals here. As for France, instead of having French scholars here, we have two Americans who are teaching in France in our conference tomorrow and day after. So we do have France represented, but in a very indirect way. Okay. So in any case, there are 2 points. The format is not going to be me asking questions. I'm just going to introduce Mukulika Banerjee first, and then Yogendra Yadav, because they're going to speak about 15 minutes. Then we're going to open it up, and we will engage into questions. Now, there's one remark. Let me introduce first, and then I have one short remark before I close before I have Mukulika start speaking her first presentation. Mukulika Banerjee is a professor of anthropology at LSE. She does political anthropology, and you get a sense of where she's at by her latest 2 books. Her second book was called Why India Votes, examines the reasons why, despite numerous challenges and obstacles, Indian voters continue to vote more and more and more, election after election after election. And there's very little explanation about why that is the case, unless it is an indication of their faith in democracy, just as it was a huge number of turnout in Turkish election recently. And this makes, at least for India, largest electoral democracy. So electoral becomes a very important dimension of democracy, which were not discussed recent in our first session. The second one is the third book of hers is called Cultivating Democracy, a agricultural metaphor, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India. It's based on her anthropological research over many years in 2 villages where how people, during the election and also between the election, try to learn, engage, and practice the art of citizenship. and how it is related to the larger macro phenomena of whether degenerative or regenerative democracy. And I can, next person I want to introduce is Professor Yogendra Yadav, or he no longer wants to be known as a professor, as he describes himself as a lapsed academic turned political activist. He was a senior fellow when I first met him at the Center for Study of Developing Society, which is a very important research organization and teaching institution in Delhi. And unlike Mukulika, who's an anthropologist focusing on two villages, and generally the sweep of Yogendra's research on democracy was much greater in terms of width and the breadth of it. During his stint at CSDS, he revived national election studies. And then he went on to actually cross-compare South Asian election studies and so on. And he co-founded a network of survey research scholars, wrote academic articles, books. Besides, also he wrote school books texts. Now, and then he went into politics and became the political affairs committee of Aam Aadmi Party in 2015. And this is a party which rules the city of Delhi. Delhi as a state, it's a kind of federal state. And it's an important party. He was one of the very key members, but then he left the party. He's among the founders of also Swaraj Abhinay and also a Jai Kisan Andolan, which is a march and social movement of the farmers, and founder president of a new political party called Swaraj India. So he's into NGO, social movements, and actually in practical politics of running for election. He was very much involved in two recent things. This is why we have a lot to hear about. One is he was involved in the march by the farmers and their engagement, and more importantly, which has not gotten the kind of attention we would have thought we would have gotten, is something called Bharat Jodo Yatra. That is a uniting India, or it is against the divisive politics, Unite India march, which took place from the bottom of Kanyakumari, bottom of India, all the way to the north of Kashmir. It took 4 months or more, and 5 months, and it involved 2,000 kilometers of march, and Yogendra walked all of that along with Rahul Gandhi. And that was the Congress party was involved, but he was also involved as a member of his own party and also the NGOs and so on. So he has just come out of that long march, but getting from Hotel Regina to here was more complicated in some ways. But in any case, these are the two very interesting people who are going to talk about regeneration of democracy in the context of what we have already discussed. They are familiar with the book Degeneration of Democracy. But I have one comment to make before we end. As you notice, there is a massive preoccupation in the discussion of democracy theory or practice or history and so on and so forth. There are two models which spring up all the time, American model and the French model. And I am of the belief that we have to introduce the third model. The Indian model of democracy tells you more about various democratic struggles across the world, and it is more than 70 years old, and it has gone through various crises, including we have here Gyan Prakash, who's written a book about the emergency and how important it was and how decisive it was in some way. And so basically, the India model. It is not just India model. I can't really describe in short period of time what India model means. You can't say, oh, one is Republican, one is liberal, like American and French, kind of a reductive model, but it's a very complex model. The other thing I want to point out is that the democratic theory, whether it's the liberal theory or the Republican theory, since the 18th century, there is an underlying anxiety about the mass democracy, about the masses, the people, the crowds, and so on and so forth. There are a variety of ways in which it has been attempt to subjugate, domesticate, and so on and so forth. Liberals have a certain strategy, Republicans have. But the idea that there is this anxiety about masses, which has resurfaced with the discussion of populism, whether the populism in United States or populism in West Europe. When you start studying India, in India, when people started talking about democracy, there was never any illusion that we can have anything but mass democracy. It has been a mass democracy through and through. And Gandhi is very often described as a first major mass politician against the older kind of a... So the idea, in a way, India, there's a lot of things when we talk about degeneration of democracy. There's an anxiety which is a repressed text about degeneration, very often comes from the irresponsible kind of a masses who are susceptible to misinformation, demagogic manipulation, who are likely to make a kind of a the kind of a decisions which are not in their interest. In India, there's this kind of argument would have very little traction, even though some liberals will say it, because Indian democracy has always been, except maybe for the first election, has been always been dominated the concerns about how to successfully run an election and how to win parties and maintain power in the face of passage. And one of the most important things about research which Yogendra did when he was at CSDS is to show how, and which is in a way repeated by why India votes in Mukulika, is that India, more people vote generally than many of the Western democracies. Not only that, women vote more than men, poorer people vote and more than anything else, they vote more in local elections and smaller elections than in a central election. Or at least that was one of his major findings. So the Indian democracy, only on that count, and to the extent you want to take elections seriously, rather than to simply think about it as a necessary evil, then you have to think about differently. And we have two people here who have very much aware of the electoral dimension, mass dimension, and the struggle against the elites in all of those kind of things. So here I hand it over. And first Mukulika.
First,
Yogendra, you want to go first? Okay.
You will go.
Okay, Yogendra, go ahead first. And, okay.
Thank you, Dilip. I should begin by thanking Dilip, Craig, and Charles for the for your book. In a sense, it is only now that we have seriously started making sense of democracy. Now that we are over that euphoria of a finished product democracy, the only game in town, now that we are also done with those pronouncements of death and so on. And one very significant contribution of your book is that it helps us move away from a very serious misdiagnosis called populism, which has dominated so much of discussion, and I wasn't quite sure what it contributed to our understanding. So it takes away from that misdiagnosis. And so in a sense, it's only now, although democracy studies is probably 50, 70 years old, although democratic theory we've been talking for quite some time. Honestly, this is only now that we are beginning to make sense of this animal called democracy. And your book makes a substantial contribution to that, so I really wanted to thank you. Second, I just wanted to dispel an impression that India is an example of regeneration of democracy. My prime minister is in the US, and nothing would please him more than a conference where US is an example of degeneration, and India, which he has announced is the mother of all democracies, to be an example of regeneration. So if his PR team ever got to know, they would broadcast this conference live on, and as you know, when they want to make it live, every single Indian channel carries it for 3 hours or so. So this could well be the case. So I just wanted to put it on record that if you actually had to draw a line if you were forced to draw a line between democracies and non-democracies, honestly, I'm not sure which side of the line India would fall today. It's a very hard decision. We are not certainly where Russia is, but we could be close to where Turkey is. Not maybe, if few steps this side, that's where we are, in a situation where what we have is something I'll talk about tomorrow, is what should be called a democracy capture. Democratic instruments have been used to capture democracy and use it against the spirit and all the claims of democracy. But more of that later. I just wanted to put it on record, as it were. And now that all of you officially know that I have nothing to do with academia anymore, don't need to make those nuanced historic points that Craig was making, and don't have to be as profound ever as Charles. So allow me to just throw 5 theses about regeneration of democracy. They draw upon India because that's the only democracy I have some understanding of. So now that we are clear that India is not necessarily a model of regeneration, it so happens that we are picking up examples of regeneration from the Indian case. And since I had some personal knowledge of participating in some of those events which are linked to regeneration, I'll draw upon that and make 5 arguments. First is, let's call it the seed argument. And the argument is this, that just when you feel that democracy has stabilized, just when you begin to feel smug, crack appears. This is the point that your book makes. But there's the other side of it. Just when they think that they have captured it all, just when they think that they can manage everything in democracy, something sprouts up. Now, this is not Adam Smith's hidden hand. This is not something which is assured to bring democracy back. So I'm not saying anything as romantic as that. But I think there's something significant about allowing the language of democracy to flourish for something like 70 years. Once you allow that language, literally the vocabulary of democracy, to percolate and for people to talk about it in however insincere ways and however imperfect ways, people begin to take it seriously. A week ago, I was traveling in Madhya Pradesh and speaking to some motor mechanic. Very, very hot day, and he was actually wiring something while speaking to me. And I said, what do you think of the government? He said, no, things are all right. Magar ye bahut tanashah log hain. Now, tanashah is a somewhat high Hindi expression. It's not an everyday word for dictator. So he suddenly says, it's all right, I'm getting what I need to get, but these people they have a strain of dictatorship. Now, this is what language of democracy does. You allow it to run for 70 years in a messy way, and it does end up implanting this sense in that person's thought idea. He's not a political activist, has very little to do with all this stuff, was very busy wiring whatever he was wiring. But he knew this thing called tanashahi, which he doesn't like. There's something wrong about it. That is that is where the hope begins. So let's call it the seed thesis. It implants seeds. Not every seed is going to sprout, and not everything that sprouts would become a tree. We don't know, but they are seeds. That's one thing. Second thesis is, let's call it the street thesis, borrowing from Dilip in the book. When regeneration takes place, by and large, it defies all the existing institutional structures. Regeneration of democracy, if and when, normally happens outside the formal institutional sphere. In India, we call it movements. It may take other expression in other parts of the world. But it's normally, it's unstructured. It involves people's mobilization. It involves the street. And all the 3 or 4 efforts that we speak about, these are things that happen on the street. Farmers' movement in India, about at any given point for about 13 months, the movement that Dilip referred to, and I was involved in that fully for 13 months. For 13 months, about 100,000 farmers were sitting outside Delhi, demanding withdrawal of 3 acts. They're actually blocking all the 3 major highways leading to the city of Delhi. So it's as street as it can get. And they all evolve a grammar of their own, which is completely unknown before that. Now, this is not a standard style of protesting. No one had ever tried that. And since I was one of the organizers in that 7-member committee that was running it, I know we had not designed it either. No one had designed it. It happened. Or take that other thing which has been less noticed, Shaheen Bagh. You know, given the current regime's anti-minority campaign, the last thing you would expect is for the Muslim minority, which is a beleaguered minority, constantly under attack from this government. The last thing you would expect is for them to be able to stand up to it. But they did. And they came up with this stunning innovation. So basically, Shaheen Bagh is the place of a Muslim-dominated locality in Delhi. And if Muslim men were to come out and protest in the designated sites in Delhi for protests, they would be beaten black and blue, they would be thrown out, they would be anti-national, they would be everything. So what they did was that they actually created a site close to that Muslim neighborhood where only women would come and sit. Men will not be allowed there. They could stand out, but the site would be, was occupied only by women. There would be discussions, and the regime just didn't know what to do with it. And mostly, these were 60-year-old women, 70-year-old women, just sitting there to say, and with all the proper symbolism of Indian nationalism, of Indian constitution. So you couldn't say this is separatism, you couldn't say this is an assault on Indian nationhood, and you couldn't say these are loonies, you couldn't say these are rogues, you couldn't say these are criminals. They just didn't know what to do with it. And once that established, then similar protests which exactly replicated this structure started sprouting all over the country. At one count, someone said there were about 200 places in the country where similar things had come up. So this is an example of evolving their own grammar, their own new ways of doing things, which defy the existing structures. But street is very much central. So in Hindi, it lends for a good metaphor. English mein nahi chalta hai.
Hindi mein bolenge.
Sansad nahi sadak. It's not parliament, it's the street. It's more, has greater rhyme in Hindi. But that's where the real democracy gets played out, not in the parliament. It happens on the street. So that's the second, this is my street thesis. Third is a thesis on small numbers. Suggest me a better name for it, yeah? But the point is this. As someone who participated in almost all of these, what struck me every time is how small we were and how big was the impact that we managed to achieve. It astonished me, and every time I was surprised because I thought, when I say 100,000 farmers had occupied Delhi, it does sound like a very big number, but in India, 100,000 is actually not a very big number. Because political parties that are defeated in election can organize a rally of 1 million people. In West Bengal, which she knows infinitely more than I do, Communist Party, which lost the election so badly last time, They organized a rally of 600,000 people. So 100,000 is not a big number for India, you know. And Shine Bags were actually even smaller, about 100 women just sitting there, 200 women, no more. They just didn't know what to do with these 200 women who were just sitting on the street. And for farmers' movement, while there were the numbers, you know, 1 or 2 days we had big numbers, it was not such a big number otherwise. And the Yatra, Bharat Jodo Yatra from Kanyakumari to Kashmir, about 3,700 kilometers, the numbers who walked were not too big. And in any case, even if you assume that every place that we walked through, every adult and child was charmed and influenced by us, it would not be 0.1% of the Indian population, you know. But something happens, and I really want to ask social scientists here, why is it that such small numbers actually end up with such big impact? The closest I come to thinking about it is to say that while the numbers are small, you know, it's not that every small number achieves this. So I'm not saying, you know, please be as small as you can. No, that's not what I'm saying. Sometimes smaller numbers achieve big effect, and they do, I think, when they are aligned with, when those small numbers happen to be aligned with a certain deeply felt desire for solidarity, something, or which I sometimes called swadharma, but I don't want to waste your time explaining all that. Or the, you know, what you at one point had called culture of democracy. You know, a small number sometimes happen to articulate. And when that connect happens, then your smallness doesn't matter. Then so Rahul Gandhi, when he was walking through this yatra, there actually were not too many speeches, you know, very disappointingly so. So you would walk from morning to the evening, and there would be no speech at all. But, you know, one dialogue which he picked up from someone. He's not someone into dialogues, he's not a great orator, but he picked it up from someone. Nafrat ke bazaar mein mohabbat ki dukaan kholne aaya hu. I'm here to open a shop of love. I mean, translating into English, it sort of becomes so pedestrian. I'm here to open a shop of love in the market of hatred. That would be the most literal translation. And that single sentence, I mean, that thing, this somehow resonated. So the numbers do not matter once you begin that kind of resonance. That's the third thesis about thesis of small numbers. Fourth is thesis on, call it fuel versus lubricant. I'll tell you what it is. When we think about democracy, we spend too much time thinking about the fuel. That is to say, you know, the resources, the large number of people who would come, who would run the system. And the assumption of a normal political activist and of a political scientist is that democracy basically runs on self-interest, which it does, like market. So we've simply adopted the market metaphor, and we've started believing that yes, it is the personal ambitions of very large number of small political entrepreneurs which runs democracy, which it does. That's the fuel. That is what fuels any democracy. But there is a tiny little lubricant that you need to run democracy. And I'm surprised political science has never theorized about it. Now, why does the left figure so much in Craig's conversation? Left is a very tiny force in Europe. In America, it's a non-existent force. In India, if you think of the left, the official communist parties, the official socialist parties, and the Gandhians, those who followers of Mahatma Gandhi, put together, all of them would still be a negligible force in today's India. But I think they performed a very critical function. Because this tiny little force, which in India was represented by them, and has had a very long shadow in the movement sector of India. This tiny sector becomes the site, becomes the inheritor of this sector produces activists, it produces ideas, and it produces practices. Models are created. This becomes the lab of democracy. The best of things are produced in these tiny little labs. Then they step out, they go to big factories, and they become big political entrepreneurs, some of them. But when those labs do not exist, democracy dries up. And that is something that is happening across the world. We don't have enough theorization on decline of politics, while we have theorization on decline of democracy. But there is serious, at least in India, I see a very serious decline of politics. Politics, decline of political judgment. The quality of political judgment in the last 50 years has just taken a nosedive, at least in the country that I know of. Decline of political judgment, decline of political mobilizational capacities. So politics was really an activity that shaped modern India as it was. And that critical activity has gone seriously down. The reason I wanted to mention all that was these movements, these small numbers, provide that lubricant to the system. Suddenly, that little tiny, while you're putting 10 gallons in your car, but this little 50 grams of it, you just add those 50 grams and your engine starts working better. That is what these small numbers are doing. What these movements then do is to actually connect, is to re-establish the connect between the street and centers of power. But more of that later. Fifth thesis is the bridge thesis. The bridge thesis is simply this, and that's a point actually that comes up in the book again in more than one place, and I'm very glad that it does, because we tend to romanticize these protests. Protests by themselves do not transform democracy, unless, as you say, it becomes a movement. But actually more than that, unless that movement finds a way of looping back to mainstream politics. So the protest is a protest against mainstream politics. But ironically, unless it manages to loop back to the very mainstream politics against which it's protested, much of that just disappears in thin air. We've just seen so much energy. Movements, protests generate energy, and in 8 out of 10 cases, it disappears in thin air, leaves no trace whatsoever. And in that sense, that's one of the hard realizations we had after, we had the farmers' movement. Farmers' movement successfully concluded, one of the few examples in India where the central government actually had to concede, and that too led by Mr. Modi, known not to, the strongest leader in the universe, probably ever since the universe began, so who is known not to back on anything. He actually had to back out. He had to withdraw these 3 laws. So we have a successful movement, part of which is located in the state of Uttar Pradesh. We have elections in Uttar Pradesh immediate 2 months after the successful conclusion of the movement. And we, riding on our success of farmers' movement, go and tell the farmers of Uttar Pradesh, defeat this party. And they have the biggest possible majority. They come back to power. That's when we sit back and say, okay, a movement by itself is not enough. You have to find ways to connect. And that's what we did in Karnataka. Karnataka is a South Indian state was controlled by the BJP, and was, for BJP, the ruling party, it is the gateway to south of India. and there was critical elections. So what we did, as soon as the Bharat Jodo Yatra concluded, having learned from farmers' movement experience, we said, we have to now preserve this energy. So we converted those of us who were with the Yatra but were not with the Congress party. We said we'll convert it into a campaign, Bharat Jodo Abhiyan. And one of the first things we did was we went to Karnataka and said, we'll just sit there now and tap all the movement energy. Karnataka has very powerful Dalit movement, farmers movement. So what we did was we spent 2-3 months gathering all that energy and connecting it to whoever in mainstream could have defeated the BJP. This was official. We actually selected constituencies, targeted them. And for anyone later interested in electoral statistics, I'll tell you how it correlates. That it came out to be beautiful correlation. So we actually can say now statistically that constituencies where movements made an intervention, when we made intervention in 103 out of 224, the swing against BJP was substantially higher in these places where we intervened. So the bridge is what you need. That's the fifth thesis. Just one last point. Having said all this and about regeneration of democracy and this, does all this dent the structural impediment that modern democracies work against, which much of the book is about, and Craig has contributed a lot to thinking about it. Basically, capitalism. What does capitalism do to democracy? Do these movements manage to dent it? I'm afraid none. No. I've not given up hope. We've had a big scandal in India recently, which is a global scandal, Mr. Adani, who became the third richest man in the world. And then there was Hindenburg report, which brought out, so a report came out which showed the kind of practices Mr. Adani was indulging in and how he was being supported by the regime. And after a long, long time, a mainstream Indian politician has picked up the courage to name Mr. Adani and say, this is what is wrong with this country. So, as I said, I've not given up hopes yet. But by and large, all this is not sufficient. This doesn't seriously dent the structures that we work against. So that's not a fifth thesis, it's a 5.5 thesis. Call it the wall thesis if you wish. Thank you.
Now Mukulika.
So I'm a social anthropologist. So I take ideas from people you've heard this afternoon, and examine them in the context of social life as it's lived, as it's unfolding while one is present. Right? So it makes it a lot more grounded, a lot more real. And so a lot of my responses and understandings of democratic practice and how democracies are created comes very much from these two villages that Dilip mentioned. They're adjacent villages, so it's pretty much the same village, really, because they're very linked on either side of a highway. And here it's like looking under a magnifying glass of all these concepts that we've been talking about in great detail of how this plays out through a 12-month agricultural cycle, and then over electoral cycles, and then over decades. So I just was fortunate enough to be able to keep this up for over 15 years. So one has a sense of how ideas develop, how people develop, how coalitions develop, how ideas about politics change. Right? And all the time that I was doing this research, the electorally most successful communist government in the world was in power. This was a coalition called the Left Front in West Bengal that Yogendra mentioned. And they were in power between 1977 and 2011. So it was also a chance to see what communism looked like in practice on the ground. And what did communism mean to ordinary people, and what the interface between communism and democracy is. We turn to Kerala immediately when we say this, but I think Bengal has its own unique story to contribute to this, which is distinct from Kerala, but that's a point of detail. So if one thinks about what social life is, who are the people, for instance, who are the farmers, you've heard from Yogendra, it's really quite extraordinary, the success of the farmers' movement. Not only are these farmers, but it's a coalition of hundreds of different farmers' organizations that come together in common purpose. If, as Craig and Charles were saying earlier, the real challenge is building solidarities. Here was, I think, an experiment in studying how solidarity can be built, but I'll come back to that later. I'm much more interested if you think about who are these people who think it important enough, feel resolute enough to give up what their day job is and come and sit on a road leading to Delhi. What gives that person the intellectual, cultural, moral, ethical resources to be able to do that? We take it for granted. We talk about people, we talk about old women. It was Delhi winter when women were sitting in Shaheen Bagh. It was really cold when they were doing that sit-in. The farmers sat through 4 seasons of all kinds of weather. What gives people the moral resources to do this? That's the question I'm interested in. So I would say that if you study what happens in a village, and I say this with the proviso that the village in Indian post-independent independence India, even by our greats, has always had really bad press, right? It's a place that is seen to be somehow a place that needs saving, that is the originator of evils that needs to be ironed out by a developmental agenda. And I'm kind of pushing back against that kind of representation of the villages, thinking about the village really as a creative space that has ideas about politics that are worth taking seriously, because they are telling us something about democracy quite fundamentally. So what is it telling us? If we understand democracies anywhere to be this combination of institutions and culture, of what Craig was saying is procedures and a way of life, what is it to live democratically? What is it to be democratic in everyday life? Then in the village, you see this as an interleaving of electoral moments. And remember, elections in India, in an Indian village, are not every 5 years. They're way more frequent because we have 3 tiers of democracy at work. So there are national elections, there are provincial elections, there are local elections. And as Dilip quite rightly pointed out, the turnouts are practically 100% when the local elections happen. Everybody votes. And at the national elections, the voter turnout is well above 80. So 85 was the average where I was working. And the people who were missing was because they were physically missing from the village that day. So if it is this combination of elections and of procedures and way of life, then we get electoral moments, and then we get these other moments when elections are not happening, but social life carries on. And this is true of all of us, if you think about it. When elections come around, most of us, I presume, in this room are avid voters. Is there anyone who doesn't vote in this room? Possibly not. But yet, the decision to vote and who you're going to vote for and how you're going to behave when the election comes around is shaped by everything else that happens in between, right? It's attending discussions like this and reading the books you do and having reading the newspapers or whatever one does to be shaped by this. Similarly, when we celebrate this massive voter turnout in India, we actually had, when Yogendra and his team found this very startling survey finding that poor, low caste, socially disadvantaged
people were more likely to vote than others, we really did not have an understanding of why this was the case. And by the way, Dilip, you mentioned Turkey. I just asked some colleagues at LSE about this 2 weeks ago, and they were celebrating the turnout. And I said, do we know why people in Turkey vote? And they couldn't give us an answer. So it is a question that I think political scientists just don't often think about. We kind of take the voter for granted. So when elections happen in between everything else, it is quite important, and this is the holism of social anthropology as a social science, the way we think, that there is no aspect of life that doesn't affect your political subjectivity. It's what kind of religious person you are, what kind of farmer you are, what kind of mat weaver you are, what kind of gossip monger you are. All of these things go into creating your political subjectivity. So what I've shown in this book, book Cultivating Democracy, is really that not only, I mean, we have to take these things seriously for what they are as institutions, but also how they interlink to democracy and how they feed into elections. And here, something that Yogendra said is absolutely key in getting the reverse relationship as well, which is that what people experience in going to vote in turn feeds back to who they are long after the election, the glow of the election has passed. Right? Because elections are like carnivals in India. They are really upside down moments when anything is possible. The reason why they are hugely exciting is because every time there is a sense of possibility that things will change, something can happen, it's generative of change. And therefore, it is important to remember that the experience of going to vote and being a participant in that carnival is also shaping people's subjectivity in the rest of their lives when there is no election. And these are the seeds, I think, that Yogendra mentioned, that 75 years of having been part of this process has also created an understanding of what it is to live in a democracy, what it is to have democratic culture, what it is to have somebody who is too arrogant, and that somehow being Tanashahi is not a democratic sentiment. You can be what you want, but it is not that there is some measure of democratic sentiment. And in Bengal, I think communism, even though it was such a problematic story at so many levels, and I've been pretty clear-eyed in my account about this, but it did introduce alongside that certain ideas about dignity of work, which in a place like India, for those of you who are not familiar with India will not appreciate just what a hierarchical relationship there is between those who work and those who work with their hands and those who don't. There is no dignity of labor, and it's a very socially unequal place. So to go back to that relation, we don't think enough about what effect being part of an electoral democracy has on the rest of democratic life. So when I used to be interested in elections, and when we did the work for Why India Votes, which was a team of 12 researchers working in different parts of India, most of my anthropology colleagues, certainly, and a lot of colleagues who work on India said, oh, come on, you take the elections so seriously, as if democracy is only elections. And it was extraordinary. And you push back, and I always said it wasn't, of course it was, you'd be mad to think democracy could be reduced to elections. But it was a kind of minimum condition that you had to take seriously, and it was a very important question to understand what people were getting out of voting. And the one-line summary of that was that, yes, you went to vote because you wanted to support your candidate or your party, but the actual experience of a polling station, of going to cast your vote, of standing in a line silently, of being treated with the same measure of respect and dignity as the next person in the polling booth, all of these things were experienced by large sections of the Indian population as the only moment in their lives. The bottom of the pyramid in India is very wide. It's more than 85% of the population. And to feel a genuine sense of political equality and what that feels like is a very powerful emotion, which then next time, so for instance, a young Dalit girl said to me, she said, when I came out of the polling booth, I felt 2 inches taller. I felt everybody in the village was looking at me differently today. Nobody was looking at her. Everybody was getting on with their business. But the point was that she felt recognized in a way. And that, I don't think, disappears the moment the election is over. It stays on. And I think this is part of the seeds of that cumulatively. And I like the word seeds because I use the agrarian metaphor a lot. Likewise, the other way also happens. And I won't have time to talk about all the different institutions. But let me give you just one example from non-electoral life that contributes to democratic culture. And you think of these are farmers, right? And there are two paddy crops, there's a wheat crop some year. So harvests are something that people understand. And bringing in a harvest is a kind of activity that everybody understands you can't do alone. There are a lot of jobs you can do alone, but you can't bring in a harvest alone. And you have a short period of a window of 4 or 5 days when you have to cut, tie, sort, thresh, mill, bag very quickly. And you're doing this for field after field after field. So everybody in the village is drafted in. And there is a division of labor. And the division of labor here is not determined by caste in a way that all social life is determined by caste and class. And not even by gender, because there are some jobs you're good at and you do them. So if you're very good at tying bundles, you do tying bundles. It doesn't matter you're an upper caste woman and shouldn't be doing something so mechanical. You do it. So there is a division of labor. But while people are doing, while you're sitting there tying a bundle, you are aware that it is a very little job. It's not heroic. You're not wielding a sickle. But if you weren't doing that tying of bundles, there would be no harvest. So that attachment of individual effort to collective good is established there. And that sense of solidarity that unless you do your little bit, the whole thing won't happen, is created there. I think it is manufactured there. And it was interesting that when finally, and I was there through many harvests, but on this one occasion, I remember when we sat down after this intense period of work, and one of these men said to me, he said, oh, this is, you keep talking about voting and you come at every election, but it's a little bit the same, isn't it? You ask us, why do I get, you ask my brother, why was he upset that he couldn't cast his vote? But it's not that it's just one vote, but we know that every vote counts. And of course, there'll be an election even if you don't vote and there'll be results, but you won't be part of it. So when you're not there for the harvest, it's not just that you are helping people bring in the harvest, but your labor is part of the common, the collective. And that sense of attachment between individual effort and collective solidarity is established through something that is not ostensibly political. It's just harvesting paddy. But it has this huge, and I do this with religion and with kinship, with all of these other non-electoral, non-political. I mean, there's a politics of everything, obviously, but these are not institutionally political things. And so, if I can now just bring it back to what Yogendra was saying and the farmers' protest, I think it is. I won't talk about Bharat Jodo Yatra, though please do ask us about it. I did join the Yatra for a couple of days, and because as a political anthropologist, I just had to be there to sense what it felt like and what was the energy on the ground, and we'll be happy to talk about it. But just to keep that farmer, paddy, cultivation, seeds metaphor going, it's interesting that Yogendra says that it creates its own grammar. And I described it as a republic of protest, because there were certain social norms that were coming out of, they were not coming out of nowhere. I think the the fact that a majority of the farmers, a lot of the farmers were either Sikh themselves or familiar with Sikhism, gave it a certain idiom of egalitarianism, of sangat, of solidarity, of being. So suddenly you began to have, okay, one example and I'll stop. The fact that when you have a massive sit-in like this, people have to be fed, right? So the Sikh Gurudwara tradition of anyone who comes to worship is fed in a langar. Right? So food is prepared in large vats. Anyone comes, they are fed. And we all know this because during the pandemic, Sikh communities all over the world have fed people everywhere, every corner of the globe, because they have this tradition of people landing up at Gurdwara, doing a little bit of work and creating these meals. But what was interesting was they were having a library langar, a massage langar, all kind of music langar, so this idea that you take two books that you have to contribute to a library, but the library is like this. It has lots and lots of books because everybody has done their little bit to attach to the collective. But as a result, what you had was a library langar that people could just drop in and read books and read newspapers. So that a protest site for over 12 months requires to nourish citizens sitting there, not just by feeding them, but you need ideas and you need music and you need massages. And all of these things were being created. And I dare say that it's impossible to understand political protest of this kind without understanding the communities and the cultural lives behind them. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to take questions. I have no response to make, so let's have questions. Okay, floor is open. Go ahead.
I don't feel comfortable to be the first one to ask a question because I'm not very well informed about that. But I wanted to ask you about the question you posed, why does India vote? And I have a very simple question. To what an extent are elections and the voting process fair? You know, one of the favorite novels I read in recent years is The White Tiger, and probably it's not the best way of getting information about how exactly democracy functions in India. But basically, for those of you who haven't read it, it's a novel that the protagonist writes to the Chinese president saying, you know, you have this flourishing economy and all that, but we're the biggest democracy in the world. And he describes these situations of people in remote villages in India where the votes are completely sold. And there are even stories spreading around that there are parts of India where you can go and can you imagine, you can really vote. So it was actually quite a tragic novel to read. So I wonder whether it has anything to do with reality.
I have to say, I try and keep up with my fiction reading, but I found White Tiger really difficult to read, and that's why I stopped reading it. I did make an effort. Elections have been mixed for a very long time. I would maintain until 2014. Of course, there were places where, on the whole, when you're talking about free and fair elections, certainly the 2009 national elections, which we studied, which produced Why India Votes, was as free and fair as that you can imagine given the scale of the exercise. 1 million electronic voting machines are used in India. The electoral size is nearly 900 million. It's 850 million. I don't know what the latest number is, but when we studied, it was 815 million. And so we're talking about a big scale. On the whole, the Election Commission of India, which is a non-partisan constitutional body. It doesn't belong to political parties or the government, as it does in many Western democracies, ran the elections, ran a tight ship. And most people felt that if they wanted to go and vote, they had a fair chance of casting their vote fairly, right? Without campaigning stops 24 hours before the day of the vote. So actually there is a moment, there's a cacophony of noise and dust and music and speeches for several weeks. And then things do pause and people can make up their minds and vote. I have said this in print in my book, that I think after 2014, some very serious distortions into a free and fair electoral process has come in. And there are many things, but I think the biggest thing, which anyone sitting, any of you sitting here, and I say this in England all the time, that when people brush it aside, I say, would you be comfortable living in a democracy where financing of political parties is totally opaque? You don't know who is giving how much money to which political party, but when the sums are done, you know that more than 90% of the money is going to one political party, and surprisingly, they're the ones in power. I mean, if that happened in your democracy that you lived in, would you find that acceptable? If the answer is no, that is what is happening in India at the moment, and there are other distortions.
Okay, let's take a question from Gyan.
Thank you both for your observations. And I'm just trying to put together or kind of solve a puzzle from the things that both of you said. So Mukulika, you said that, elections or the experience of election kind of bleeds into other parts of life. Okay? And, Yogendra, you said that, after farmers' movement, you expected that the experience of the farmers' movement would show up in the election result in UP, but it didn't. And that you took that lesson to Karnataka, and so it required you to actively, bring that experience of farmers' movement and Bharat Jodo Yatra into election. So I'm just wondering, I mean, how does one square these two different experiences?
Do you want to go? No. So I don't think the bleeding is, I prefer Veena Das's The Evented Every Day. That's how she talks about the event, the afterlife of the event after it's passed, and it fits perfectly with what I'm describing. That is not an electoral one. It's not an electoral story. So even though actually Bengal is a good example to explain this with, the 34 years that the Left Front was in power, they could not ever be complacent that, oh, they have voted for us and this is going to continue to remain our support base. They had to work very hard every single day to make sure that the next election was also theirs. So the afterlife of the election is not a support for a political party. What it probably, and what I was saying is that it creates a certain political subjectivity in which you imagine yourself as a citizen with certain rights, a certain dignity, which there is no other arena in Indian public life that gives you that sense of self, right? In the farmers' protest, I think the capacity to bring an arrogant government to its knees, the sense of possibility was opened. And I would argue that anyone who comes after that to protest anything, the farmers' movement therefore has become the lodestar, that it is possible. Does that mean you're going to oppose the BJP because it is the same government that brought in the laws, etc.? Is it going to translate into electoral? No, and I'm not making that claim either. And I think, therefore, the Karnataka story is interesting because it took, even though it was only, 2-3 months after the Karnataka election, January end, Bharat Jodo Yatra ended, but that passed to Karnataka in November. I mean, it was at the beginning, or October even, right? It was quite early on in the thing. So this was, and the elections happened in April. It took a heck of a lot of work to make sure, as Yogendra was saying, that energy was converted. But because that work was done, political scientists actually looked at the data of the districts, the constituencies through which the Yatra passed had an incredible swing in favor of the Congress. But that it had to be mediated. You could not assume it. That work had to be done. But maybe you
just to supplement what she said, I think my interest was in fact very narrow and small, which is, yes, farmers' movement has impact, has deep long-term impacts on values, attitudes, would set up patterns and so on. But would it, my interest was, would it directly contribute to voting choices in the next 3 months? And that, I've realized, is something you cannot assume unless you carefully build those connects. Then you end up affecting, making some impact on the political culture. You end up making some impact on public opinion. But that is not marshaled for one specific political outcome that we desired. So I guess I was interested in a very small subset of the questions that she was interested in. But that subset happens to be of some importance right now.
I think we're going, one more question? Yeah, okay.
I had a question, Phil Howe, former fellow at the EVM. I had a question for Dr. Banerjee, but that last comment actually, I think, means I want to hear from you as well. I'm fascinated by this account of elections and what motivates people. I'm a political scientist. I'm in electoral studies myself. It seems to me there's a certain tension present in voting that isn't there on a harvest, which is in a harvest, you've got to do your small bit or the food doesn't show up. You're doing that in an election, but you're also disagreeing with all the people around you, right? You go into the voting booth and you might be casting a vote that cancels out the point of view of your neighbor. And I'm wondering how people negotiate that, because the way you're describing it, it's very much a collective it's very much a collective activity, but one built around fundamental disagreements about the evaluation of candidates and about values and ideology and so forth.
Okay, let's take another question and then, rather than.
Sorry, my question is very naive, but it's to you. Given that India is so diverse, one state is so different from another. It's the same as, say, somebody marching through EU countries.
Exactly, absolutely.
Yeah? Did you pick up any common threads of concerns as you walked from north to south? Or there was nothing common?
Okay, so I'll should I?
Yeah, good.
Yeah. In a society in which a very tiny proportion of people own the land and have exploited agricultural labor for many years, a harvest is not a touchy-feely, happy moment at all. It has its agonisms as well, right? So in fact, people were so terrified about talking about politics because the Communist Party was so draconian about shutting down any talk of politics, that people said, you want to understand politics, come to a harvest, and then you'll feel what political tension is about. So in that sense, it's not dissimilar to elections. But what interests me is that, and this is where it comes down to, a community cannot afford only to have agonisms of elections, of land reform, you have to have reparative institutions of some sort, where the fact that you know that your neighbor and you vote for different electoral parties, but the fact that you go and wash your dishes together in the same pukur, because that's what you've done for 20 years in the little tank, is actually quite an important ritual, because it brings you back together. In the same way that in a harvest, the fact that it so happened that this one harvest Ramzan was on at the same time. And so the prayer meetings in the evening had nothing to do with the divisions of land and ownership and labor. And people were coming together to create completely new constellations of solidarity. So communities would fall apart, actually, with agonisms of democracy and land, if you didn't, and that's why they always have mechanisms to keep people together. Thank you.
On that Bharat Jodo Yatra, just, we have to place the yatra in the context when it took place. It happened, the yatra took place between September and January of September 2022 to January 2023. Prior to the yatra, there was a sense of gloom about Indian democracy. Everyone had concluded that Mr. Modi is here to stay for as long as you can see, that there is no alternative, that 24 is a done deal. The parliamentary elections of 24 are a done deal. You have to only now think of whether you can possibly dislodge them in 2029. No point in looking before that. That was and that there really was no alternatives. That's the context in which we started walking. As you rightly said, this is actually like walking through the EU, and the kind of diversity that we have is amazing. Which of course was one of the things that we rediscovered, that diversity does exist, notwithstanding urban India and its standardizations and its, India is a very diverse place. But more than that, I think what gave me a lot of courage and hope is that all the impression that we had in the drawing rooms of Delhi and in seminar rooms and so on, when you actually speak to ordinary people in their setting, all those things do not loom so large as they did for us in Delhi. That people's everyday concern, that in the last instance, politics is about everyday concerns, that the Hindu-Muslim question, which has been turned into which has been foregrounded so much, that everything in India can be made Hindu-Muslim. I mean, Corona, the COVID was Hindu-Muslim in India, because you could actually, so Muslims were seriously blamed for spreading COVID in India. There's a train accident that took place 10 days ago, very serious train accident. And for the first 24 hours, it was about how to blame Muslims for the train accident. So everything could be turned Hindu-Muslim. But walking across India, brought back that hope that not everything is Hindu-Muslim, that the cultural, civilizational heritage that we have inherited is actually still there. It's not, living in urban areas and speaking to educated Indians, sometimes I feel we've almost completely lost at least the heritage of the last 150 years. Freedom struggle and the heritage, I sometimes feel we've completely lost speaking to educated Indians. But walking across the country and speaking to very ordinary people gave me back that confidence that no, that heritage is still alive. We need to touch it. And that if there is half an alternative, people are still willing to reinvest their hopes. So that really energized me. And one of the most beautiful moments for me was actually in the Kashmir Valley. You know the situation in the Kashmir Valley, I don't need to explain to you. Frankly, no mainstream Indian politician would have the guts to walk in the Kashmir Valley. When they do, even if the Prime Minister of India has to walk there, they would probably clear 10 kilometers this side and 10 kilometers that side, kind of thing would be cleared, and then only something of this kind can happen. And there we were walking. Yes, there was the security was all around, more to keep people away from us than to actually protect us. And there was such rush of Kashmiri ordinary people who just wanted to hug these people who had come walking from Kanyakumari to India. There was this sense about, after a long, long time, a mainstream politician from the Indian heartland had that kind of reception, which to me gave that confidence that the unity of the country that we talk about is potentially still there. You know, you need to build on it, you need to revive it, you need to activate it. But I personally came out of that yatra much more energized, much more fitter as well. Walking 2,000 kilometers, but also emotionally charged and energized.
I think we're going to end on that hopeful note, and that regenerative project, as they have tried to present it to us, is a complex, multifaceted one, and it's not a simple, straightforward thing. And we thank them for alerting us to the possibility and hopefulness of this project. Thank you so much for this evening, and I'd like to thank Ludger and IWM for organizing this extraordinary public event and getting it invited. And now we are going to go have some wine.